take place here. Seeing what the ambassador has talked about from historical approach of all these agreements, coming down to what Obadiah just talked about, which was basically an update of where we are with the implementation of those agreements. It kind of started a thought in me, and my colleagues started talking about an aspect of social policy that is still not moving forward. Now, by way of background, let me just help you to think through this with me. The AU has actually this overall umbrella that basically came up with the policy document. And they have held various meetings on different levels. In fact, the last one was in May this year, where all African ministers on social development have met. And on every conclusion of this ministerial session, they have probably focused on an aspect of those social welfare policies. Now, we have moved, for instance, at the beginning, right after they launched the first meeting, to now the second ministerial session focused largely on a certain target group. They focused on the aging, focused on rehabilitation centers, focused on monitoring and evaluation frameworks that we've just had Dr. Malafia talk to us about. Then from there, they met again in Ghana, and now try to advance the agenda further by coming up with an action plan, which was going now to assist them on another target group, which is now people with disabilities, persons with difficulties, and social discrimination that we have just had from these presentations. Now, the last one focused on families, which now touches greatly on the Child Act, and obviously talks about what Dr. Malafia just presented on, which is about women being excluded from actually being participants in these social welfare policies. Now, that, as a person, gets me worried about where we are in terms of social welfare and policies that are being put in place. Are we making theoretical approaches to all these welfare issues we're dealing with as nations? Are we following what the African Union is actually putting in place theoretically and not handing it over to the relevant authorities in different government sectors, and some of which are actually presented here? Now, this is a question that I'll throw back to everyone to start to kind of think about where we have reached with our theoretical approaches. Now, before I do that, let me go back to the last meeting that was held of the Ministers of Social Development that took place in Addis Ababa this May, which talked about family, strengthening African families for inclusion development, which is almost a concluding statement from what Obadiah has been talking about. How do we make sure that we have inclusive development through our social welfare policies? Now, the campaign has gone on, and obviously it's now coming up with a lot of legal policies, like my colleague just talked about, on how do we protect and handle different aspects of, the different target groups we're dealing with. How do we mobilize continental awareness of social welfare problems that we have in these countries? Now, this is part of the campaign that Mr. Collins has taken over, which is how do we bring this in the open? How do we try to look at what has been put in place to translate that into practical ways? And I would like to kind of merge that. We have diplomats attending this meeting today. How do we get them to be grassroots policy implementers? How do we get them involved? How do we invoke them to come in and be part of this building campaign on social welfare? Now, then of course we have increasing the capacity of non-state actors who undertake evidence-based policy like you were talking about in terms of monitoring and going out there and meeting the target groups. Ambassador, I was caught up by your statement that you made during your presentation. And this was, you talked of international agreements must be shaped at the national level. I think that's almost a beginning statement for us. Even while at national level, we still need to go further than that. National level, how far do we go? And the grassroots, how much do we involve the grassroots in ensuring that indeed this our efforts to engrave these policies are passed over to the most needed? You know, like you talked about women being great economic changers. Are we including them in our national policy development? We're not. Some countries have done well, but obviously, again, think about that. I will try and get comments from you in a few minutes. What are our expectations? Now, African states must begin to embrace the best practice policy. Now, I just had Megan talk about UK, and we are very quick at actually almost copying what they're doing and trying to bring it to our countries. Is there a possibility of actually trying to embrace the best practice policy, which entails learning from one another? We have regional similarities, you know, national similarities. Some things happening in Tanzania are the same things that are happening in Kenya. And there are things they're doing better than we're doing, and vice versa is true. Is there a possibility of us coming together and actually understanding how they're doing it differently, and how can we make that work in our areas before we can go into international agreements and try to translate them? Because regionally, we really need to start from that level first. Now, obviously, there are countries who are embracing best policy practices. For instance, you know, we can learn from Mauritius. Mauritius is actually one of the countries that is, from the index of social welfare, is the top African country. Can we learn from them? Now, it could be a small country, great economy, but there are lessons we can pick. There are some countries that are also of the same population, but are struggling. Now, my second point will be, it is also imperative to ensure we have a holistic policy environment that supports and promotes human rights, builds on capacity, and empowers individuals and the community stakeholders, obviously, and organizations that change the attitude and the cultural plus the religious norms that hinder this social welfare inclusions. For instance, we have policies back home, like now we're talking about the Ebola crisis. Now when you look at the Ebola crisis, it can actually be contained, but some of our cultural practices are probably hindering that curbing of that disease. We have practices you have heard and read from some of the countries that have gone through this process, where they have suffered from encouraging families to allow not to get contact with the dead from the Ebola, from the disease. And because of culture, we believe, oh no, we cannot allow people to bury each other in that manner, but let's adjust. And that continues to spread. Now again, a hindrance because of our traditions and attitudes. So how do we get a shift on that? How do we get to a place where we can say, well, this is a good cultural idea, but how do we translate that to the current crisis that we face? Now, policy papers, my third and last point would be on policy papers that can be translated into national initiatives. Now, this actually brings me to the role of embassies. I am actually happy to see the Embassy of Nigeria presented here, because that's one of our, big brother countries, and we're hoping they will drive this issue further. But the role of embassies is almost so critical in our participation in international agreements, Ambassador. When we come up with, by the time they come up with these agreements, agreements have gone through various stages where we participate from that level. How do we influence those agreements to suit our local needs? How do we influence those agreements to be able to actually address the needs affecting our nationals? Are we waiting until we're signing for us to come up and say, whoa, wait a second, that's not going to work in our countries? So the role of embassies is absolutely essential in ensuring that nations understand these agreements that we're yet to sign and the implications to the nation.